Hello, my name's Ashley Milan. I'm an independent property and housing specialist working with organisations and individuals across East Central Scotland. I'm the director of Ashley Milan Limited and founder of Sure Home, a social letting concept Scotland. I've been asked to talk to you today about the impact COVID-19 has had on private tenants, and more specifically around the impact the pandemic has had on the private rented sector. To do this, I will draw upon my experience of working with a registered social landlord based in West Lothian between March and November this year, coupled with my own experience within my own property housing business. So to set us off, what is the private rented sector? What does it look like today? Well, the private rented sector is now a tenure of choice for many, and a housing tenure very much within its own right. Where the private rented sector used to be a stopgap for those looking to rent for short periods of time, a trial before committing to purchasing, or for students or professionals looking for short-term lets, it's now seen as a viable housing option, with individuals and families choosing the private rented sector to meet their longer-term housing needs. Tenants like the flexibility offered in the private rented sector, and research indicates that many private tenants like the prospect of paying a single monthly rent with no additional bills for repairs or maintenance, as these are picked up by the landlord. Recent research states that many private tenants have a good relationship with their private landlord, and with around 340,000 homes provided for by the PRS, it is certainly an important part of Scotland's housing system. The other side of what I've just talked about, though, is that lack of supply and the development of social housing. And tenants with more specific needs have also turned to the private rented sector to secure a home and meet their longer term housing needs. This means that some of the country's poorest and most vulnerable people are living in homes that are often not always fit for purpose, with little in the way of support from their private landlord or letting agent. Whilst the sector has changed drastically over the years for the better, as the Scottish Government has introduced a raft of new legislation in a bid to help increase standards and provide tenants with increased security of tenure, it is my feeling that private tenants cannot escape the impact that COVID-19 has had on affordability, as the virus may have only compounded those deep-rooted inequalities we see throughout society, resulting in our country's poorest and most vulnerable being hit hardest. So in March this year, the country went into a national lockdown. Schools, universities, businesses, local and national, were all shut, with members of the public being told to go home. Work from home where you can was the message from government. However, as we know, not everyone could work from home, and the government launched its Furlough Scheme to support businesses throughout the pandemic. 80% of an employee's wages, up to £2,500 per month, would be paid to them throughout the duration of the scheme, with some employers choosing to top up to a full wage where they could. So what did this mean within the private rented sector? Well, interestingly, from my experience of working with the registered social landlord in West Lothian, I can say that initially there was very little difference in arrears figures that I seen in the first 3 months of the national lockdown. Whilst, like many housing businesses, I'm sure we had planned for a spike in arrears and put protocols in place to support tenants quickly, the furlough scheme seemed to do its job and certainly helped tenants continue to meet their monthly commitments, I would think. Rents continued to be paid in full in April, May, and even into June. Interestingly, many of our private tenants that had been affected, who had lost their jobs or had a reduction in their income, were choosing to use their savings or borrow money from family or via some form of lending, such as a credit card, to pay their rent in full rather than apply for universal credit. There was very much a mindset from what I've seen that this was just a short-term thing. People would be back to work soon, and where people had lost their jobs, there was a real optimism that they would pick up work quickly. We didn't really seem to see a huge sense of panic initially from that tenant base. Arrears remained steady through to July, where we started to see a spike. However, that spike initially was not in new arrears cases, but in existing arrears cases where payment plans had already been in place pre-lockdown. For the first time in July, we've seen that tenants were starting to negotiate by asking to pay 80% of their rent or asking for some kind of rent reduction. If they were only receiving 80% of their income, then they only wanted to pay 80% of their rent. And of course, many companies agreed. But what was happening there is that there's a slow burn of arrears and other debts building up in the background as a result of servicing rents and other household bills earlier in the year. And that's quite worrying. All landlords, and private and social, will inevitably want those arrears accrued to be repaid at some point. And given that the arrears cases we've seen in West Lothian at that time related mainly to those on low incomes, there needs to be some consideration of how organisations and landlords within the private rented sector will deal with this in the future and work with tenants to ensure realistic repayment plans and other forms of welfare rights support are in place. This hasn't traditionally been a service offering provided in the private rented sector by letting agents and landlords. So this is something that will need to be considered carefully now. It's likely that many private tenants will be dealing with the ramifications of the pandemic many months after society returns to normal, and that is something I'm quite concerned about, specifically within the private rented sector where, as outlined before, there is less support for tenants when compared to the social housing alternatives, and that the people affected are already those on the lowest incomes and arguably the most vulnerable. Of course, affordability does not just relate to rents. We did see an increase in demand for support in the form of food bank vouchers and warm home vouchers. Some families really struggled with homeschooling. The increased bills as a result of internet access, the requirement for laptops and computers to allow their children to take part in Teams schooling. In addition, many of our tenants raised concerns or voiced concerns to us generally around how their children were coping. Many children had turned to computers and video games in a bid to stay connected with their peers, and this proved to be very problematic for those families who were on lower incomes as they struggled to try and resource those new activities. The increase on the weekly food bill also took its toll, with many families worried about where they'd find the additional money to feed growing and hungry children who would normally eat one meal a day at school. These were things that, as a subsidiary of a registered social landlord, we were able to assist with. And interestingly, since leaving that role to work for myself full time, I've seen a huge desire from private sector letting agents looking to offer their tenants additional types of support services. I would say that because letting agents are often not perceived as being formal housing providers by many third-party support services that tie in with housing associations, etc., that they are often forgotten about. This was an area that was picked up by Shelter Scotland some years ago through the creation of a Letting Agent Plus programme, and that programme helped private agents create pathways with local authorities and other external agencies in order to benefit their tenants, help tenants sustain their tenancies and access further support services. Unfortunately, this was just a trial. However, a similar model I think would work very well in the current climate. Looking at affordability in the private rented sector in a wider sense, we can see that it doesn't just relate to private tenants, it also relates to private landlords. We've seen a number of private landlords who were really quite adamant to help their tenant despite their own financial woes. Many private landlords had been made redundant or furloughed themselves. And when you look at the makeup of Scotland's private sector housing stock, you can see that over 80% of private landlords actually only own one or two properties. And this really isn't a full-time profession for them. However, that being said, I've seen personally a real sense of community, certainly within West Lothian, in terms of landlords really looking to help their tenants, and that resulted in rent reductions, some landlords offering their tenants food parcels, help with shopping, and it was really quite nice to see and refreshing to be involved in that. In terms of looking at how legislation has changed to protect private tenants at this point and safeguard them, we can see how the Coronavirus Scotland Act means that a landlord must provide their tenants with 6 months' notice to leave at this moment in time. And that could mean great financial difficulty for private landlords now and in the future. A tenant must be in 3 clear calendar months' notice before a notice to leave can be served. Looking at this realistically, it means that a tenant would need to be owed 4 months' rent before the notice could be served. After that, 6 months' notice would be given, which means that a landlord could go for 10 months without having any rent. Even if the tenant doesn't leave the property, they would have to raise an action with the first tier tribunal, which could further impact their own financial situation. Sadly, not all tenants engage effectively, and they may have abandoned their properties or may just not be looking to pay any rent. We did actually engage with tenants who were quite frank and said, we are not paying our rent because actually our landlord isn't paying their mortgage, even though we know that is not the case and that is not the right thing to do. Despite the situation, landlords must follow strict processes, which are somewhat more stringent than that seen in our social housing counterparts. So there's inevitably there are going to be financial repercussions for private landlords. They may decide to sell their rental properties, which could have a deep and severe effect on the supply of private housing in a sector that's clearly so badly needed. Looking across the sector, it seems to be very much right now a case of business as usual in terms of letting property and demand. What agents and landlords are looking to now is the mopping up in terms of supporting tenants to repay their arrears accrued throughout lockdown and in adapting to their different circumstances. So where a tenant took up a tenancy as a full-time employee of a company where management needs were very low, they may now be unemployed, searching for work, requiring assistance with claiming universal credit and other benefits, and they'll be maybe dealing with the emotional and physical effects of that, all of which private agents and landlords must do their best to support. And I'm sure there are many agents throughout the country now looking at that and planning ahead to ensure they can provide as much support as possible for their landlords and tenants. So what next for the private sector throughout the pandemic? Well, we did see a steady demand for property throughout the lockdown, and when restrictions were finally lifted, that pent-up demand resulted in pre-lockdown figures for many private landlords and letting agents, and so we did see the sector effectively bounce back. At the time of presenting to you, we see a private rented sector that's operating fairly normally. However, this is all naturally subject to change. If we go into another lockdown, how well businesses will cope with the various tiers and restrictions that are currently in place, and what the world will look like at the other end. We've already seen how businesses are reviewing and refining the way in which they work, making working from home more permanent and doing away with office space. That in itself will ultimately lead to redundancies as office-based staff are let go. Better use of technology will have allowed businesses to work more efficiently, realising cost-saving measures, and this will also, in my opinion, lead to further job losses. These things will all influence local and national economies and people's ability to meet their financial commitments, such as rents. It'll be well into 2021 and beyond before we can truly measure the effect the pandemic has had on affordability in the private rented sector. I'd like to thank you for listening today and thank the organisers for inviting me to speak, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your conference.